Hello, my name is Jordan Manning and I'm a Master's in Education student at Concord University. This semester I'm in Reading 560 with Dr. William Williams, and this is a book study discussion video for my class. The book that we're going to be discussing is called Unspeakable Acts and Natural Practices, Flaws and Fallacies in Scientific Reading Instruction by Frank Smith. And the purpose of this book study video is to discuss some aspects of this book, fill out this graphic organizer about the book, and then ask some questions at the end for feedback from the people viewing the video, and just to see what people think about this book within my class and in the greater community of those that will watch this video that hopefully will learn something about this book. When I first saw the cover of this book, I was a little less than excited to read it because I feel like it was going to attack everything that I thought I knew about teaching and turn it upside down and say you've been doing it wrong, you've been taught wrong your whole life, and here's why. And so I was really dreading reading this book. However, it was one of the books in the class that I had never read before. Some of the other ones we were asked to read were books that I'd had for other classes. So this is the one that I chose to do my video on. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the author, Frank Smith. There's a picture of him right here on the back of the book. And Mr. Smith has always been fascinated with language and how we learn it and how we incorporate it into our daily lives, and how it's kind of seen as a natural act that you are born knowing, you learn sounds and you put them together and you form them into words, which would make reading into a natural ability for all students and all people. He worked as a journalist in many countries before getting his formal education in Australia. This led to him getting his PhD in Harvard. I'm reading this from the back of the book, so if you don't catch what I'm saying about him, you're always welcome to look at the back of the book as well. He was a world traveler. He did a lot of lectures. He did a lot of writing, and did a lot of thinking about learning on his journey to become this man that he is. He worked as a professor in Ontario, Toronto, the British Columbia, South Africa. He published many articles and many books about learning and what we think we know about learning. One of them is entitled Between Hope and Havoc, Essays into Literacy, Joining the Literacy Club, and then Insult to Intelligence. He wrote many of them for the Hyman Company, which is who he published this book through as well. Mr. Smith is an interesting man from what I've gathered from his thoughts and his feelings about reading and about how we teach reading and what we consider, and I say we as in like teachers and people who have gone through formal teacher education programs, what we consider to be scientific-based reading instruction versus what he feels reading instruction really is, or the lack of instruction, because it should just be a natural ability, which is something that we'll get into later on in the discussion questions. Right now we're going to look at this KWL chart. That's the graphic organizer that I chose to include in the video. Most people are familiar with KWL, but if you're not, it's what you already know about a topic, what you want to know about a topic, and then what you learned once you addressed the topic, once you jumped in and you learned more about what was going on and how that answered what you wanted to know and how that challenges what you already know. So what I already know about reading instruction, at least based on my own experiences and my formal learning through Concord and my master's program, I definitely already know that it's difficult for all children, not all children, but it's difficult for some children. Typically, what I thought I knew, oh, I spelled that wrong. There we go. With the 22 children that I have in my class, they all are third grade students. However, they did not come to me being able to read fluently, and they definitely were not all on grade level. And in an ideal world, you would think third graders would come to you based on, we take a STAR reading assessment at my school. And so based on their STAR data, they should have come to me on a third grade first month reading level. They should be in the first month of third grade, they should be ready to learn, they should be able to just jump right in and start that reading for learning like they should do when they transition into third grade. However, most of my students come to me on a first grade reading level, a second grade reading level. If I'm lucky, they come to me ready to learn on a third grade reading level. So what I think I already know is that it's difficult and it doesn't come natural for all students. Another thing that I already know about reading instruction is that based on my own experiences, it's done best in small groups. I think small groups are where you can really see what students know and you can really individualize their learning based on what they know. And another thing that I think that I already know about reading instruction is that it's got to pique their interest. If I'm reading a book to my class and it's about dinosaurs, and about 75% of the class says, man, dinosaurs are terrible, then they're not going to be hooked, they're not going to be motivated, they're not going to want to learn more about what I'm reading simply because it's not something that piques their interest. However, if I've got 22 kids in this classroom and I know all 22 of them love playing baseball, then I may pick a reading selection or start a reading unit about baseball. So it's something they're interested in. It fits with the season, even though it's snowing today in April. Typically it would fit with the season. And it's something that they already know a lot about, so I can hook them in and help them to learn more by sort of tricking them in a way to think, oh, this is fun because it's about baseball, when really it's about reading instruction. So I think it should already pique their interest. Now, based on the title of this book, Flaws and Fallacies in Scientific being in quotation marks, which makes me think he's kind of making fun of the term scientific here, reading instruction, what I want to know from this book is what he considers scientific reading instruction. So one thing I want to know is, what is scientific reading instruction? I'm going to abbreviate here. Another thing that I want to know from Frank Smith in his book is why he says unspeakable acts and unnatural practices. What is unnatural and what is unspeakable about teaching reading? Teaching reading is something I love to do. It's why I'm getting my master's as a reading specialist at Concord. It's not always something I've liked to do. I've not always wanted to be a reader. I've not always been motivated to read. However, teachers along the way and my family along the way motivated me to open a book and really discover what I can through reading. And so that has inspired me to become a reading specialist. So I want to know what is so unnatural about the practices that I learned through my formal college education and that I've learned in my own classroom the last 2 years. So what is scientific reading instruction and why is it unnatural? One more thing that I want to know about this book and from this book and from the author is, what types of research did he do to say that the scientific reading instruction that we've known and always known, what makes it so unspeakable and so kind of in a way harsh, and that what we're doing may be hindering a student to learn instead of helping them to learn? And so what was his research? And so again, for my KWL, I've just to give a quick recap. The K is what I already know, or at least what I thought I knew before I read this book, which was that reading can be difficult for children. I feel it's best done in small groups. And it's got to be something they're interested in, or you're not going to keep them long term. You're not going to keep them motivated. And that is something that I've learned from my action research. This class is called Reading 560, and it's action and reading research. And so for my action research project this semester, I chose to figure out what motivates my students to read, and what I've learned mostly through that research is it's got to be something they're interested in. I mean, I've got 22 9-year-olds in this classroom. Some of them are 10, some of them are still 8, but at the same time, they're not all interested in the same things. And so getting a library of books that pique all of their interests and get them hooked into reading is something that's difficult, but something that I've aspired to do through my research. So interest is a big thing, I think, in teaching students to read. They've got to be interested in it, or they're not going to pursue it and they're not going to dig deeper into it. What I want to know from the author is simple. What is scientific reading instruction? Why is it unnatural? What about it makes it unnatural? And what was his research? What did he use to say or to claim that these acts that we're learning and these acts that we're practicing are unspeakable and unnatural? The next thing that's kind of on our agenda here is just an overview of the book. We're going to talk a little bit about each chapter. I'm going to read a few portions from it, and then we're going to fill in what we learned And then lastly, I have 3 discussion questions and a little thought to leave you with at the end of this. So we're just going to jump right in and remove my post-it note there. And what really got me hooked to want to do this book for my project is the preface or the preface. I don't really know how you say that, but it's okay. I always say the words wrong. But it says, the instruction to which I refer to focus on early and intensive training in phonics and phonemic awareness. The underlying idea by sounding out the spelling of written word in an intelligible spoken word will be produced. So basically, what I've always known, back to my W here, or back to my K here, sorry, what I've always known is that phonics lays those foundational blocks for reading. You know, you have a child in kindergarten and you're teaching them the sounds of the alphabet and the letters of the alphabet and blending those letters into words and segmenting those phonemes and manipulating them in a way that help children understand what words are. So like if we had the word cat, I would look at the child and I'd say it, repeat after me, cat. And then we'd clap the word together and we would say cat. Or a word like bag, b-a-g. And they'd clap it and they'd say bag, and they'd blend those parts together. They'd blend those phonemes together. And that's always been taught to me as the building blocks of reading. Phonemic awareness, the alphabetic principle, phonological awareness under that umbrella that encases all things like onset and rhyme. And again, phonemic awareness, the blending and segmenting of phonemes, what a grapheme is, and getting students to learn those building blocks. But yet in Mr. Smith's book, he says that decoding only resembles spoken word. And I can see that in a way, and I kind of understand his argument there in saying that the English language is difficult. It's not exactly phonemic. If you take the word like know, like K-N-O-W in our chart, you don't say kno. That would be sounding it out phonologically. Or canal, because O-W can also make the ow sound. There are so many, what's the word I'm looking for? There are so many like broken rules, I guess you could say, in our English language. Like, well, KW or KN always makes the n sound, the n sound, except when it's like this, or I before E, except after C. All of these rules, there's always an exception to a rule in the English language. And so right off the bat, I can see one of those arguments he's making in this book, simply because I can't look at a child and say, well, sound it out. I do that often. I catch myself all the time. Like one of my kids would ask, well, how do you spell the word knock? Like someone is knocking on the door. And I say, well, sound it out. And they go, n-a-k, N-O-K. There we go, knock. No, that's not right. It's K-N-O-C-K. Because you have the blend of the CK there to make that K sound. And then you have the KN, that silent K. And so I feel almost in a way, when I ask my students to sound out words, I'm putting them at a disadvantage because they can't necessarily sound out every word in the English language. They definitely can't sound out every word in the English language. And so right here, before we even jump into a chapter, I'm kind of starting to see the argument that Mr. Smith is making. And I'm understanding what may be a little unnatural about the way that we teach reading. Again, if you open up to page 1, it starts with the alphabet. It says there are 3 main things that contribute to his argument: the alphabet, language, and the brain, and how all 3 of those work together in a way to either make reading natural or reading how we teach it unnatural. And so right here, this quote that I'm going to take from page 1 says, proponents of direct, intensive, and early phonics training for reading, or for teaching reading, partly justify their peculiar instructional beliefs by asserting that, unlike spoken language, learning to read is not natural, and that reading itself is unnatural in its activity. And this book takes the opposite view on that. So that opening quote is saying that, well, reading is hard, reading is not what we do naturally, reading is not what the brain is wired to do. That's why we have teachers to help them teach them how to read. And we build those blocks with phonics and the alphabetic principle in those early years where we're teaching the students to read. so that when they get to this room, when they get to 3rd grade or 4th grade or 5th grade or beyond, they can no longer sound out words, and reading does become a natural ability. They start to read for learning instead of learning to read, which is a beautiful thing about the 3 and up grade levels, is it's when they should come to you prepared to do that. But if they should, why so often? And which is another reason why I picked this book. Why so often do they not come to you that way? And is it because what we're teaching or how we're teaching it isn't a natural act or an unspeakable act or an unnatural practice for these kids? And so he continues in chapter 1 by saying that there's a limited set of letters in our alphabet, and they could simply be called shapes because, I mean, who called them letters? Who gave them that label as the letters? There are circles and sticks and dashes and squiggles and dots, and together, as you can see above my board here, is we have the cursive alphabet, and we have cursive letters, which is a whole nother set of issues for kids when learning the alphabet and learning to put letters together to form words, because we have a manuscript alphabet and we have the cursive alphabet. And so again, he discusses that in the book and just how the letters themselves are strange. Who said that X makes the X sound, like in box? Looking at that letter, it doesn't make me think that it makes that sound. And so that's just adding to his argument of what makes reading so unnatural and just difficult in a way for kids, because we say, well, here's a bunch of letters. This is what they sound like. Well, who said they sounded like that? How did they get that purpose? And so again, he just continues on in chapter 1 explaining how the alphabet and how it earns its keep, so to speak, how it becomes what it is and how it helps students to gain that natural ability. Excuse me. And then if you read on, he discusses the brain and how brain research tells nothing about itself except the brain itself. We may point to various irregularities in the brain to try to account for why things occasionally go wrong, but we can't use the brain itself to explain what's going on. And so that's just saying the brain is an organ. How the brain works in your body is just, what's best for your body or what it tells your body to do. But because something is going wrong with a child's ability to read, you can't necessarily say, well, it's their brain. You need to say, like, what part or what's going on, or maybe it's how their eyes are taking in the information or how their ears are taking in the information, or maybe they're not taking in any information. And so the brain can't compute what's going on. And so you can't simply just say, well, there's something going on in their brain, when there's a whole list of factors and a whole ladder of things that you have to go through to figure out why a child is having difficulties with reading. Skipping along here, because chapter 1 is just really all about what makes it natural or what's unnatural about the way we do it, I marked this page on chapter 2 because it says the marvel, but not the mystery of reading. It says making a mystery out of a marvel as chapter 2's title there, but it says that reading is more of like a marvel. It's more of a thing that happens in an odd sense of a way, and it's not necessarily a mystery of reading. It's not like this big secret code that kids need a key to unlock, because ideally, it's a natural practice. It should just come to them with the ability of what they've learned and what they know. I liked this part that it says, reading is not a crime. There is no decoding to be done, no secrets to unravel, no clues to piece together. You don't have to be a detective to learn how to read. I won't discuss whether reading is like math. There's too much to question in those assumptions behind mathematics instructions, which he hits in chapter 9, which we'll discuss for a little bit. So what is reading? What other things are like reading? And he's already said, which he makes note here on page 15, that reading is making sense of print, an everyday aspect of most people's visual world. If you look around my classroom, you'll see that I have print all over the walls. I have posters, I have anchor charts, I have books, I have sayings, I have acronyms. And all of that is visual print that the kids are exposed to. They have name tags. If you look down the hallways at a school, you have classroom names. Everything that kids are exposed to is print. And so if they can't, it should be a natural thing since it surrounds them all the time, which I think is another premise of his argument in this book. And so chapter 2, again, just discusses really what reading is and why there shouldn't be a secret to it, why it should just come to kids in a way that it makes the most sense. And I'm going to skip around. In chapter 2, Mr. Smith also discusses, let me find the beginning of it. He discusses like an educational episode that's a debate that's been going on for several years between Glucon and Socrates, and just about how they felt about reading and how learners are, and to decode the Greek language. And really chapter 1 and chapter 2 to me were the most interesting of this book, just because I thought it really hit home his argument the most. Like I said earlier, in chapter 9, he discusses more so about mathematics and how it can relate to reading. I enjoyed the chapters about phonics, which is chapter 4, how phonics can become an educational hazard, just like I said earlier, telling your kids to sound a word out, encouraging them to think in letter chunks or word chunks and not really whole words, because so many of our English language words don't follow those rules that we tell our kids. Like, I can teach my kids about syllables, and then the next day I'm like, oh, but here's an exception to that syllable rule, or here's an exception to that phonics rule. My favorite chapter in this book was chapter 6, called A Federal Fetish. It's about how the federal government encroaches on how we teach reading. Maybe the government says, well, everybody has to give this test this year, and so that test is what we teach our reading instruction to. But it's not necessarily the best way to teach reading instruction. And so looking back at our chart, that's just a little overview about the book. But what I learned, so this is what I know, or at least what I thought I knew. This is what I wanted to know. And then what I learned from this book is that it's not so necessarily that everything that I've done is a lie or everything that I've been taught is untrue, but how I've interpreted how to teach reading has changed. So I learned to interpret reading differently, reading instruction differently. Going a little outside my box here. I write bigger than I draw, so it's a little sloppy. And another thing that I learned is basically, one thing is to stop basing a lot of my instructions on phonics, and the idea that phonics is the key to having students read the best. And so I learned more about phonics, or how it's kind of okay that a child doesn't quite grasp the concept of phonics so much, because we have so many exceptions excuse me, to the rules of phonics in our language. So just again, before we cut to some discussion questions, the KWL is my graphic organizer, and it's what I already know, which was that reading is difficult for most kids. I feel it's best done in small groups, and it's got to pique their interest. What I wanted to learn was about the scientific instruction, what is reading in a scientific way? Why is it so unnatural, and what was the research that he did? And I gained a lot of information about the research that he did from this book. And then what I learned was how to interpret reading instruction in a different way, and the basis of phonics maybe isn't the best thing to build on that foundation of natural reading. I'm going to leave you with 3 questions. And the first question is, you as the reader of this book, or you as the viewer of this video, do you agree or disagree with how Mr. Smith explains how we teach reading and what we base our reading instruction on? And if so, why do you agree, or why don't you agree? The second question, is what do you use in your own classrooms or in your own families with your children? What do you use to teach reading to your kids or to your students that Frank Smith says that you probably should not use? I know I used a lot of phonics, as you can see probably on my board, our phonics skill for the week. We have a phonics skill every week with every lesson, and I feel maybe I put too much emphasis on the phonetics of reading and not so much on the fluency and the comprehension and the understanding of what they're reading. And my last question is, what would you like to ask the author? What would you ask Frank Smith, if you could, about his book, or about any of the books that he's written that are outlined on the back of this one, and his views on reading? I would love to ask him, first of all, why he chose the cover of this book to look like it does. Maybe it's to pique someone's interest, because it definitely piqued mine. I would like to ask him how he was taught to read as a child, what he learned through reading instruction through elementary school, middle school, and even in his formal education at Harvard and all those other universities he attended. So those are just some questions that I have. Thank you guys so much for watching my video, and I hope you enjoy it, and good luck on your future teaching of reading instruction. Bye.